Today we're gonna find out just how far a max tempo can go on every single map in BTD5. That's right, all 73 of them. Wait, that number doesn't sound right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 98, 99, 100, 101 maps? Well, we'd better get started then. But first, I should tell you, I'm enabling the Super Monkey Specialist building, which will make the temple even stronger. This includes giving it an activated ability that I'll be showing you guys soon. Additionally, I also have my Monkey Knowledge Lab maxed out, so this will truly be the ultimate test of the Monkey Temple. Now of course, you can also sacrifice towers to it to make it even stronger, and specifically, in this game, it's $30,000 worth of Ice Monkeys, Wizard Monkeys, Glue Gunners, Mortar Towers, and other, which literally can be any other tower you want. But a temple can actually absorb jungle drums from a village to get a 15% attack speed bonus, so that's the other tower I'll be sacrificing. It's also important to note, if you sacrifice bombs instead of mortars, the temple will fire missiles 3 times more slowly. So now that we have all our sacrifices set up, let's make our first of many temples to come and see just how far it can go on BTD's most iconic map, Monkey Lane. Now, this should go without saying, but the early game is going to be absolutely no problem for it whatsoever, and while the temple is doing its thing, I just want to quickly let you know, I'm planning to stream for 24 hours straight on January 1st going into the 2nd, and I'll be starting at 4 AM Pacific time or 7 AM Eastern Standard, so if you happen to see me live that day, it'd be really cool to have you stop by. I'll drop more details on it towards the end of this video though. Now, my plan with the temple is to let it go as far as possible without using its ability, and then we'll see just how much further that gets it. Pretty soon, it was time to face the first ZOMG on round 85, which still doesn't give any trouble. And since the temple has pretty much infinite pierce, the early free play rounds were no issue either. In this game, after round 85, every round has a random RBE that consists of waves of ceramics, Moabs, BFBs, and ZOMGs. And while the temple was handling them all pretty well at first, it didn't take too long for the ZOMGs in particular to start becoming more difficult, as all of the Moab class balloons also gain health and speed every round past 85 as well. This began forcing the temple to chase the ZOMGs down, which usually means the tower is getting pretty close to failing. And sure enough, just one round later, on 119, the temple would fail for the first time. So now, it's time to use the Vengeful Temple activated ability, which briefly doubles attack speed and gives the temple 2 beams at once, so we can see just how much further that gets us. Okay, well, this is pretty underwhelming. Are we still just gonna fail in the same round? Well, at least I'm giving the temple 3 tries to go as far as possible in each map, in case it gets unlucky with one of the free play rounds having a particularly high RBE. And on its second attempt, the Monkey Lane temple did manage to get to round 122, and then it also failed to that same round on its third attempt. So yeah, I'm kinda disappointed with the Dark Temple ability now, honestly. But our next map is called Mosaic, and I'm trying to place the temple in the center of each map so that this test can be as objective as possible, but this one kinda has the track in our way, so I'm gonna have to get it as close to the center as I can. And if you end up enjoying this video, liking and subscribing really goes a long way to help it reach more people. As you can imagine, a project like this takes something like 80 hours to make, so I definitely appreciate the support. Now, I'm thinking Mosaic might be a little bit better for the temple than Monkey Lane was, because the track is laid out a lot more optimally. The way the balloons have to travel down long, straight paths will allow the temple to take better advantage of its pierce, in addition to the fact that they also cross the same part of the track a second time after going around these loops. And as we get into free play mode, where things actually start to matter, you start getting to see what I mean, because the balloons are actually making it far enough now. But honestly, I was kinda surprised this layout didn't help us more than it did, because this temple still failed on round 125 without the ability. Although I do think the Dark Temple could also be more effective with this map as well. As you can see, whenever I activate it, the temple is much better able to take advantage of the huge increase of its damage per second by wasting a lot less time chasing down ZOMGs. But the problem is, all that time where the Dark Temple can't be active. And on this map, it ended up failing on round 127 on its first try. Then on the second, the round was insanely difficult, and the temple still got really close to beating it but just couldn't quite close the round out. And then on our third try, the temple simply had no chance whatsoever because the RBE was so high and a huge wave of ZOMGs came right at the end of it, so I guess round 127 is where it ultimately fails. Up next is the map Alpine Lake, and it's fair to say the temple is going to get past round 85 on every single beginner map, so that's where I've begun recording. And that still is true with Alpine Lake, but honestly, the temple is beginning to struggle a lot earlier on this map compared to the first 2 we've tested. I guess the track layout just isn't ideal for it. Like, are we even gonna make it to round 100? This is already getting close in the mid 90s. But thankfully, the tempo was able to keep on pushing on, and it did actually surpass the round 100 mark, although these rounds are getting tougher and tougher. And on round 105, you can see the tempo just barely survived with this crazy clutch, and just one round later, it would end up failing without its activated ability. And with it, we were able to beat 106 and get an even crazier clutch on round 107, but again, just one round after clutching, the tempo failed with its dark ability for the first time. And on the second try, the tempo still failed to 108, and I honestly thought it had a good chance on the third attempt because the RBE was lower, but all the ZOMGs came out at the end of the round and still managed to overwhelm it. So yeah, this is going to be our lowest record so far by quite a bit. But I think this next map, Bob Sleigh Run, should be a little bit better since it has a few straight paths for the tempo to fire down, and as you can see, this track setup is allowing for the tempo to easily hold all the balloons back towards the entrance during the early free play rounds. But something that I'm quickly starting to learn is that once you get past like round 110 or so, free play is already a lot tougher than it was just 15 rounds ago, and with that said, the tempo had already failed by 115 without the Vengeful Temple ability, and with it, we were able to get to round 118, and you can see just how bad the end of this map is for the temple because even the Vengeful one couldn't catch balloons there, and sure enough, the second and third attempt both failed just one round later, with the third one being right as I managed to get the Vengeful Temple activated, so that was kind of annoying. Now we're on to a map called Dance Floor, which I believe was added to BTD5 pretty recently in order to celebrate the game's 10-year anniversary, which you can kind of tell based on the track's layout literally being a 10. And it also happens to be quite good for this particular challenge, as the entrance is set up in a straight line that's perfectly positioned for the temple to blast right down it, and even once the balloons start making it past this point, they have to make a turn up the map and then turn back down it, which stacks them on top of each other and allows the temple to continue taking advantage of all its peers. And it doesn't actually have to start chasing balloons until towards the halfway point of the map, but even here, the balloons loop around twice, allowing for more of them to be stacked on each other. All in all, this allowed the temple to make it all the way to around 126 without the Vengeful Temple ability, and then it was able to get up to 128, 129, and finally, around 130 while using it. Up next is the map Nazca Lines, which is the one I included during the intro of this video. And this is the first map that actually has balloons coming down two different paths at once, but thankfully, they're really close to each other at the entrance as they make up the legs of this monkey which comprises the track layout, and because of this, the temple's beam is able to basically cover both the paths at once regardless. Once the balloons make it past this point, the temple does begin having to chase them around the track, but thankfully, the layout of this map does tend to stack multiple paths of balloons on top of each other at times, which of course is a huge advantage for the temple as well. And you also have this final loop at the end, which does allow the temple to catch even more balloons, and ultimately, it was able to get all the way to around 129 without the Vengeful ability, which is definitely a new record. So now, we're poised to potentially set a new overall record as well. And using the ability only got us to 130 on our first attempt, but to be fair, I really think the massive ZOMG rush at the end of the round is what did us in here. However, the second attempt only got the temple one round further, to round 131, which it also failed to with its third attempt. So this map is the new record holder, but only by a single round. Our next map is sort of perfect for the holidays, with it being called Toyland. And beyond that, there isn't really too much to say about it honestly. This map doesn't have the best layout, because it forces the temple to chase pretty early, but the good thing is that the path goes up and then back down, so the temple's beam is able to shoot across two rows of balloons while it's having to chase them down at least. And once they get past the halfway point, the balloons then have to go up and back down, which allows for the same exact thing to happen. So with that being said, this ended up being a pretty decent map for the temple, despite not looking like it, and that allowed it to reach around 117 without the Dark Temple ability, before getting to round 122 with it. Although the temple couldn't get past this round with its second and third try, so this is where it'll ultimately have to settle. Now it's time for a map called Daffodil, which doesn't look too impressive, but it has this one loop that's absolutely insane. In fact, for a while, it almost seemed like the temple could defend infinite ZOMGs here. I mean, check out how well it's doing here on round 123. But just one round later, I was quickly proven wrong, as the temple failed without its Vengeful ability. The main problem is that as soon as any balloons get past the loop, the temple has to chase and doesn't have a good opportunity to catch everything. However, I did notice that the ability does seem to be quite a bit more effective on this map than it has been on some others, because it can blast all the balloons while they're stuck together in the loop, and it managed to get us to round 128 with our first attempt, and then an extra round with our second, which is also where the temple ultimately failed. The next map we're playing on is Parking Lot, which has a pretty decent layout for the temple, at least I think. It does have to chase down the balloons somewhat, but they go down a straight path and they kind of come towards the temple at certain points, which gives it a chance to fire down the path, and then they also have to return down it as well, which gives the temple ample time to destroy a good amount of balloons at once. And this allowed it to do well in the early free play rounds, continuing to look comfortable as it passed the 100 mark, and then the 110 mark, before ultimately failing to round 119. So now, let's see if we can at least get a few more rounds out of the Vengeful Temple ability. It seems to be decently effective on this map, especially when there's a chance to shred through a ton of ZOMGs at once, and on our first try, we were able to get to round 121, then 122, before ultimately making it to round 124. Now we're onto another map that's perfect for the winter season, as it features a prominent snowman in the middle of it. However, that means I can't place the temple in the center of the map at all, and have to settle for placing it next to the snowman instead. Now, the actual track layout looks really ideal for the temple though, as it features a prominent loop where it can easily shred through a ton of balloons, along with a few more loops past that point as well, so I had really high hopes for the temple here. And it did perform well, cruising past the 100, 110, and 120 mark, but you can see at this point, it is really starting to struggle, and the temple ended up failing to round 123. So now let's see how much further the Vengeful Temple can get us. Well, with it, we still just barely survived round 123, and then on round 124, the ZOMGs were just absolutely insane, and the temple simply had no chance against them. But on its second try, the temple did get luckier with an easier RBE on that round, but then proceeded to fail to round 125 on both its second and third try. Oasis is another map that has an obstruction in the middle, and I think this one is even more egregious than the snowman on the last map, so I got the temple as close to the center as I could, but it's definitely not ideal. But the actual map itself features a long, winding track that stacks the balloons on top of each other decently, although the temple never actually gets a great opportunity to fire down a straight path or into a loop. So, Oasis was probably a little bit below average, I would say, as the temple failed to round 115 without its Vengeful ability, and then proceeded to have a really crazy save on round 116 once it did have the ability, another clutch on 117, before getting its first fail on round 118. And on its second attempt, the temple had yet another close save that got it through round 118, which has become a really common theme for some reason on this map, before it ultimately failed on both the second and third attempt at round 119. Up next we have a map called Bloom, which lets us get much closer to the center with our temple, and it also has a decent curve in the beginning, which allows the temple to shred through several different balloons at once. But as they started getting past this point, the temple had to chase pretty badly until the balloons reached the bottom right, where they stack on top of each other once again, giving it another opportunity to hold them back. And after that, the balloons also kind of have a bit of trouble escaping, because the track does the same thing here, with allowing the temple to hit several of them at once, and ultimately, this allowed it to reach round 121 without its ability. Honestly, I kind of expected more, given all of the advantages that this track seems to provide. With the Vengeful Temple ability, it got to round 123 on its first try, then 124 on the second, which also took out the temple on its third and final attempt. Present Delivery is yet another map that's perfect for the holiday season, although it's not so ideal for the temple, as it forces it to immediately chase the balloons. However, they do have to travel down and then back up in a straight line, which at least allows the temple to shoot through two different paths of balloons at once. And after that, they have to come at the temple in a straight line, which of course is perfect for it, especially with the fact that the temple can also hit balloons at the entrance from this point. Unfortunately though, once the balloons get past there, the temple has to chase them once again, and it ended up failing to round 116 without the Vengeful ability. Once I started using it, the temple was able to reach round 118, which it also failed to a second time, before ultimately failing to round 119. Now I have to be honest with you guys, I expected Rabbit Holes to be the worst map we've tested so far, based on the overall layout and seemingly short track length, but I was quickly proven wrong, as the first loop allows the temples to hold the balloons back extremely well. Even though it has to start off by chasing balloons, at the halfway point, there is a nice straight path for the temple to fire down and destroy a solid amount of them at once. And even once they get past that part of it, the temple is able to hit a ton of balloons at once because they have to wrap around the loop a second time as well. So it wasn't too long before the Rabbit Holes temple surpassed the mark set by the temple in Alpine Lake without even needing the Vengeful ability. The second loop also created a similar effect to the first, which allowed the temple to reach round 124 without its activated ability, and even here, it was only leaking small balloons. With the Vengeful Temple though, it was only able to get one round further, and I don't just mean on the first attempt, but with the second and third as well. Alright, I guess I really just never realized how many winter themed beginner maps there actually are, as we're now onto one called Snowy Backyard. And honestly, it kinda reminds me of a snowy version of Monkey Lane. there aren't any loops for the temple to take advantage of, but rather a couple of straight paths that are well positioned for it to fire down and shred through many balloons at once. Towards the end of the map, the temple does have the chase, but the balloons do have to go straight right and then immediately turn left and then turn right again on a path directly below, which at least allows for 3 lanes of balloons to be shot through at once. And ultimately, the temple ended up reaching round 119 without its vengeful ability, and then it actually got super lucky on the next attempt, as round 119 only had one small wave of ZOMGs, which you almost never see past round 100. But then, things went back to normal, and round 120 just barely took out the Vengeful Temple on its first attempt, before going to round 122, and then 123 on its third and final try. And considering that's only one more round than Monkey Lane, I think my initial assessment was pretty fair. Now I expect this next map to do pretty well, as the balloons have to wrap around the temple 3 times in a row. Oh, and I should probably mention it's called Sprint Track, by the way. And there's also a decent straight line at the entrance which the temple can fire down and pierce through several balloons at once. However, I should have considered the fact that even though this map does stack 3 lanes of balloons on top of each other, the temple is still chasing them the entire time, so it was only able to reach round 110 without the Vengeful ability. And with it, we did get to round 113 on the first attempt, which is actually a pretty decent improvement for the ability, all things considered, but after that, we only got to round 114 on the second and third attempts. And now, it's time for my pride in enjoying BTD5, Express Shipping. I'm expecting this map to set a big record because it's by far the longest map of any in BTD5 and has been used to set the world record for the highest round in the game since it was added to it. Although, I have to say, the temple seems to be struggling a lot earlier than I expected here, and yeah, I can't believe I'm saying this, but it failed to just round 120 without the Vengeful ability. And even once I started using it, the temple failed to round 123 on its first attempt, along with its second, before ultimately failing to round 124 on its final try. So yeah, I don't know about you guys, but that's definitely going to be my biggest disappointment of this video, because I honestly expected like round 140 coming into this. But the show must go on, and I am expecting the temple to do a bit better on this next map, Checkers, as it has a layout that stacks the balloons on top of each other over and over, allowing the temple to shoot through many of them at once. Other than that though, there isn't really too much to say about it, as that basic idea is literally the entire map. But the temple was able to reach round 126 without the Vengeful ability, and with it, we ended up reaching round 130 on our first try, second try, and unfortunately, that was where it failed on the third and final attempt as well. And for some reason, there were a ton of ZOMGs on this final attempt in particular. Up next, we have a map called Skull Peak, and I got the temple as close to the center of it as I could. The beginning part of the track is good for the temple, as it allows it to fire down a straight path and take advantage of its peers, but after that, the track layout forces the temple to begin chasing the balloons until they reach this dock section in the middle. Once here, the balloons have to travel in another straight line that's head-on with the temple, and additionally, previous balloons that are just entering the dock also get hit at the same time. Thus, you can see on round 123, despite there being a bunch of ZOMGs at once, the temple was able to handle them pretty well once they reached this section. Unfortunately though, good things always have to come to an end, as round 128 took the temple down without its special ability. And just like with Checkers, the first attempt with the ability got us to round 130, which is where the temple ultimately failed after its second and third. Now we're onto a map called Lobby, and based on its layout, I expect this to be a worse version of Sprint Track. The straight path at the beginning doesn't even really help the temple because it's so short that it has to almost immediately begin chasing balloons regardless. However, once the balloons have wrapped around the track for the first time, they do have to go further down the path in order to reach the inside track, which actually does give the temple an advantage. And apparently, this was not only enough for it to surpass the worst record of the video so far, which was Alpine Link with round 107, but it continued going strong as well, by also passing the Sprint Track temple itself without even needing the ability yet. And now that we're getting further into the tough free play rounds, I'm realizing that the way this track loops directly around the temple at the end is actually quite great for it, as this allows the beam to shred through a ton of balloons at once. In fact, on round 119, you can see just how well the temple can handle a bunch of ZOMGs at once because of this layout. Ultimately, I was quite surprised by the temple getting to round 126 without even needing the Vengeful ability, and with it, I wonder if we could potentially even set a new record. Well, maybe not, because on our first try, we failed to round 129, and unfortunately, just like we've seen with the last few tracks, the second and third tries didn't get us any further either. But still, this is way more impressive than what I was expecting, especially considering that Sprint Track was the second worst track in the game itself. 3 times around should be an interesting map, because, true to its name, the balloons have to circle around the temple 3 times on this relatively small loop, and there is also a straight path at the beginning, but that doesn't really do much to keep the temple from having to chase. And with that in mind, I wasn't sure how this map was actually going to turn out, because the loop is going to stack a lot of balloons on top of each other, but it's also quite small and forces the temple to chase a lot, and honestly I can say things worked out to be a little bit above average, all things considered. The temple got to round 123 without the vengeful ability, before making it to 124 on its first and second attempt, and thankfully, instead of also failing here with its third, the temple actually made it to round 126 instead. Alright, the amount of holiday themed beginner maps is starting to get kind of ridiculous, because this next one is literally called North Pole. The actual layout of the map has a small straight line at the entrance, but that doesn't really help the temple hold the balloons back. Instead, the next part of the track with this zigzag layout ends up stacking a lot of balloons on top of each other, which gives the temple a great opportunity to take advantage of its pierce. The runway was also solid for it as well, and allowed the temple to reach round 121 without the vengeful ability. Then it failed again to this round because there were a ton of ZOMGs before making it to round 123, and finally 125. Now we're moving on to a map called Patch, which would have been perfect a few months ago for Halloween, and for some reason, it has a random pool in the center of it, so I had to place the temple next to that. The track layout itself is long and winding, which immediately forces the temple to chase balloons, but it is able to catch them as they come around each bend, along with getting to fire down a straight part of the track in the middle. Since the track does go back and forth, it also allows the temple to fire through multiple lanes of balloons while chasing them at least, and ultimately, it was able to reach round 119 without the vengeful ability, before failing to it again on the first try with the ability, mainly because there were a ton of ZOMGs. Doesn't that sound familiar? And on the second try, the temple proceeded to make it to round 123 before reaching 125 on its third. And this feels kind of weird to say, but I think 6 extra rounds is actually one of the best results, if not the best, that we've seen from the Vengeful Temple ability so far. Up next we have a map called Maze, which for whatever reason also has a random pool in the middle, although you can barely even see it with the temple on top of it, but I have a feeling this map has the potential to become our new record holder, as it is one of the longest tracks in the game, and its layout stacks the balloons on top of each other, along with sending some of them towards the top, which gives the temple extra time to deal with everything as well. And sure enough, the round 100, 110, and 120 mark quickly fell, with the temple reaching round 127 without the vengeful ability, which is already really good. And then with the ability, the temple got to round 131 on its first try, which ties Nazca lines for the highest round of any map so far. But unfortunately, it couldn't get any further with its second or third try, so we'll have to settle for a tie. This next map is called Fireworks, which I guess is a name based on how the track kinda looks like a firework explosion, but it should also be quite interesting for the temple, since each point on the map gives it 2 straight paths to fire down, which are close enough together near the point to be hit at the same time. So, I would think this map is just about perfect for the temple honestly, since it should almost never have to chase. And sure enough, it wasn't long before it had surpassed the round 125 mark, which is already pretty rare, especially without the vengeful ability. And on round 128, you can really see just how effective the track layout actually is, and I believe this is now the furthest we have gotten without using the vengeful temple so far. But honestly, I was expecting even more out of this track than what I got, as the temple went on to fail to round 130, and the vengeful ability only got it 1 extra round on its first try, before bringing it to round 132 on the second, which is also where it ultimately settled. But still, this is a new record by 1 round at least, and now I realize that fireworks actually go off on the game over screen, which doesn't seem like the right thing to celebrate, but now the map's name makes sense. I think this next map we're on, Brick Wall, is pretty similar to Sprint Track and Lobby. There is a straight path at the beginning of the track, and then the balloons have to travel around the temple for a long time. The main difference though, is that instead of completing full loops, they have to travel on the outside of the wall first, then turn around and travel the whole inside of it before they can escape at the bottom. This allows for 2 paths of balloons to be stacked on top of each other, which definitely does help the temple out a little bit at least. Although this map still wasn't super impressive, with the temple reaching round 116 without the vengeful ability, then getting to 117 on its first try, barely surviving it on the second, and ultimately settling on round 118 after its second and third attempt. Z Factor is a map I'm really curious about, because the balloons have to travel around all these tiny circles, which should stack a bunch of them together, and I think the temple's beam should be wide enough to cover the entire width of the circles once the balloons are coming straight at it. And you can really see here, even at the beginning of the track, the temple isn't having to chase as much as you'd expect because the balloons are having to travel around each circle before making forward progress and all getting kind of stacked on top of each other. And before long, the tempo was surpassing the 110, 115, and round 120 mark, eventually settling on round 125 without the Vengeful Temple ability. And with it, we were able to get 6 more rounds on our first attempt, which made me think it had a shot at tying or even setting a new record, but unfortunately, just like many temples before, this one failed 2 more times to the same round, putting it into I believe a 3-way tie now for second place. And now we're onto the map Park Path, which has a track layout that reminds me of Lobby if it was just split in half. And with that kind of layout, the temple of course has to chase the balloons from the very start, although it can actually catch a decent amount of them when they come around the first and especially the second bend, as this also allows the temple to attack balloons that are coming from the entrance at the same time, along with the bend itself stacking a lot of balloons on top of each other. And I'd say this map was about average honestly, as the tempo got to around 120 without the Vengeful ability, and with it, we got to around 122 on the first attempt, 123 on the second, and 124 on the third. Up next, we've got yet another winter-themed map in the form of Ice Rink, and based on its layout, I'm thinking it should be one of the better maps in this video. The balloons have to come at the temple straight on, which allows it to pierce through a decent amount of them, and beyond that, there are also 3 different loops the balloons have to travel around, which have seemed to be really effective for the temple on previous maps. And sure enough, it wasn't long before it had surpassed the round 120 mark pretty easily, which is usually a good sign that will at least make it to 130. Without the Vengeful ability, the temple failed on round 127 though, but sure enough, it got to exactly round 130 on its first attempt and couldn't get any further with the second or third. Now I think Roswell is one of the coolest maps in this entire game because it's actually based around a real life incident that took place in the town of Roswell in New Mexico, and essentially, there are some conspiracies around alien activity occurring there, which is why this map features a crashed UFO and a sign that literally has an alien on it. As for the actual track layout, it really reminds me of Monkey Lane and Snowy Backyard, as it consists of straight paths that are connected with sharp, mostly 90-degree turns. And at first, it really seemed like the temple was going to fail to a very similar round on this map as it had on the 2 I just compared it with, as it first failed to round 122, and then was barely able to clutch this round with the Vengeful Temple ability before failing to round 123. But then, on the second attempt, rounds 123, 124, and 125 were all a little bit easier than you'd normally see past the 120 mark, so it wasn't until things went back to normal in round 126 that the temple would fail on both its second and third attempts. And just for reference, Monkey Lane went to 122, and Snowy Backyard was 123. And at long last, we have the final beginner map of the game, Space Truckin'. And I am pretty curious about this one, because it has a very unique layout from all the other tracks in the game. Things start off pretty standard, with the balloons coming down a straight path from the entrance towards the temple, but then they have to travel around 3 different planets before making their escape towards the sun. I guess it's kind of similar to the map Lobby, but the balloons aren't actually circling in on the temple, so I don't really know what to compare it to. In any case though, I really wish there was more to say because the temple's performance here was honestly quite average, as it failed around 123, and then, with the Vengeful ability, it only got 1 more round on its first, second, and third attempt, albeit the third one was extremely close. And now, we have finally moved on to our first intermediate map of the video, which just so happens to be the newest map in the game currently as well, Dark Dungeon. And this is the first time we're going to see an actual unique feature with the map, as once the balloons reach this trapdoor, they'll disappear into it and re-emerge from the other one over here. You might also notice I started recording on round 50 instead of 86, but I still expect the intermediate maps to make it to free play, and this was mainly just done as a precaution for the first one. But Dark Dungeon quickly proved it's actually better than Alpine Lake, as it soon managed to surpass the round 110 mark before failing to 116 without the Vengeful Temple. And with it, we were able to reach round 118 on our first attempt, along with the second, before getting to 119 on the final one, which is still better than a few of the beginner maps honestly. Fast Track was also added to BTD5 pretty recently, and at first glance, you'd think it should have been a beginner map instead, because the track layout is pretty similar to something like Monkey Lane, but there is one key difference. Anytime the balloons pass over these arrows, which are actually conveyor belts, they move significantly faster than normal. But honestly, The first one isn't very helpful for the balloons, as it ends in an immediate 180-degree turn onto normal track, which makes it pretty easy for the temple to catch balloons near the entrance for a while. But once they get past that point, it does struggle a lot more with chasing balloons. However, they also tend to get stacked up on top of each other near the exit, so overall, this map was even better than Dark Dungeon, as the temple reached round 120 without even needing the Vengeful ability, and then proceeded to get to 123, 124, and finally, round 125. Now, Overthrown is a really special map in this game, because any tower placed on these thrones is able to attack 5 times faster than normal. So what we're going to do first is build a temple off the throne, see how far that can get, and then we'll see how much further it can go while sitting on one. The track layout itself is pretty terrible for the temple though, since balloons come at it from 2 different opposite sides of the track, so it has to keep on going back and forth, and additionally, they force the temple to immediately chase as well. The one saving grace here is that these 2 paths join into one briefly in the middle, so the temple can hold the balloons back somewhat at this point, and once the path does split again, the temple is actually able to cover both of them at once. And somehow, this was actually enough to still tie Alpine Lake's 108 mark without even needing the Vengeful Temple ability. Once I began using it, round 108 didn't have a single wave of ZOMGs, which has to be the highest round that's happened on so far, and ultimately, we were able to get to round 112 on the first try, which also took the temple out on its second, but the third attempt really shows how important RNG can be, as each wave of ZOMGs was spaced out from each other, thus allowing the temple to get its ability back in time and actually survive this round. But on 113, it would suffer its third strike. And now, I know we're all curious to see just how much better it's going to be with 5 times higher attack speed, and I gotta say, I'm not disappointed so far. The temple is absolutely shredding through the balloons once they reach the middle point. However, I was kind of surprised by just how quickly the temple already began struggling again, like, surely the balloons haven't gotten 5 times stronger already? So I don't know, maybe the buff doesn't apply to its main solar beam projectile, and it's only affecting the other projectiles that get added from the other tower sacrifices. In any case though, the temple got an extra 10 rounds without the Vengeful ability, before reaching round 126 on its first, second, and third try. It's really crazy that it only got 1 round further than Fast Track while using the throne. This next map, Lonely Heart, has a heart-shaped lake taking up the entire center of it. So in order to get the temple in the middle of the map, I decided to place it on a pontoon. The reason there are some extras is that I actually had to place some of the towers I was sacrificing on pontoons as well, in order to fit all of them within the Sun God's range when I turned it into a temple. Now, the track layout itself reminds me of a worse version of Sprint Track, although the last time I said that, I was proven quite wrong. But I mean, this map literally is just a heart-shaped version of Sprint Track, but with only 2 lanes instead of 3. And thus, the temple only got to round 107 without the Vengeful ability, although it did get to round 110 on its first try, and then 113 on its second, which is only 1 round short of Sprint Track. However, the temple couldn't get any further with its last try, so I was finally correct with the prediction, even if it's only by a single round. Autumn Leaves is a rather simple map when it comes to the track layout, and the path is a lot wider than that of most tracks, which I guess is to simulate the feel of a casual walking trail that you'd find in a park. But the straight paths do offer the temple a few opportunities to shoot through several balloons at once, including at the entrance, which always helps, but it also has to chase them anytime the paths aren't lined up favorably for the temple. And the map isn't quite as long as the beginner ones used to be, so the temple ended up failing for the first time on round 112, and then it got to 113 on its first try using the Vengeful ability, before getting to 115 on the second, and finally, round 116 with its final try. Forgotten Garden starts off with a large section of the track being covered like a greenhouse, which is able to shield the regular balloons from being attacked, but it's too small for the Moab class balloons, which leads to a ton of ceramics pouring out of the end of the greenhouse during these early free play rounds. At that point on the track, the balloons are traveling straight down, before having to turn up, and then going back down again, which does allow a bunch of them to get stacked on top of each other at once. And I didn't realize just how effective this was actually going to be for the temple, but as it goes to chase ceramics, it's also hitting several different lanes of more freshly spawned balloons, including the Moab class balloons that are just coming out of the entrance. Additionally, the temple can also catch the balloons when they're crossing the bridge, which is good since it can also hit balloons at the entrance from this point as well. So, all in all, Forgotten Garden ended up being better than most of the beginner maps, with the temple reaching round 126 without the Vengeful ability. And with it, we were able to get this really nice clutch on round 128, before failing to round 130 on the first try, along with the second, and then, the temple actually got lucky, with the third try being extremely easy for such a late round, which allowed it to end up reaching round 131. Now we're on to a map that's called Head in the Clouds, which is pretty unique compared to everything we've played on so far. If you look at where the track breaks up the clouds, you can actually see a city below as well. But the actual map itself forces the temple to pretty much immediately start chasing balloons, until they reach the point where they have to face it head on, which allows the temple to hold the balloons back for a little while at the very least. Past that though, it has to chase them again, and overall, this map wasn't great for the temple, but also was not the worst one so far either, as it was able to reach round 115 without the vengeful ability. Then it failed to that round again because there were a ton of ZOMGs. On the second try, it got to round 116 and the game actually crashed for some reason, but when I loaded back into it, the temple failed to that round with both its second and third try. Up next we've got the map Flooded Lane, which is literally a flooded version of Monkey Lane, so there isn't much to say about it honestly. Thankfully, there is a wooden raft in the center of the map, which is perfect for our temple to sit on. And just like you'd expect, the performance here was almost identical to that of Monkey Lane, with the temple failing on round 118 without the vengeful ability, and with it, we got to round 121 on the first, second, and third try. Now we're on the map Walk in the Park, which splits the balloons into two paths with this circle here early on, forcing the temple to chase them, and then it also has to chase them at the bottom of the map while balloons are trying to escape on the middle path as well. One thing that does help a little bit is the fact that the two paths do meet at a point here, and the middle path is lined up straight with the temple, but this is too little too late, as it failed to round 109 without the vengeful ability, before getting to round 110 on the first try, and then 112 on the second and third. Ancient Tomb is another map that isn't laid out very well for the temple, as the balloons are split into two different paths that force it to chase them, while flipping back and forth. The temple can catch the balloons somewhat at the top of the map, where the path comes at it straight on, and they also stack a bit after that, but it still failed on round 109 without the vengeful temple ability, then 110 on the first try with it, before failing to round 112 on the second and third try, which is exactly the same as the last map. Now I think Hearthside should help you all feel nice and cozy for the holiday seasons, with the Christmas tree, the random fish tank, and presents scattered about. But for the temple, it's a little less pleasant, as the balloons are only held back a little bit by the fact that they have to enter on a straight path that faces the temple, and after that, it has to chase them for a while until they reach the bottom middle of the map, where you have the same situation as the entrance, but these really are the only two good points that the temple has to actually deal with the balloons effectively. So, as you could imagine, this map wasn't much better than the last two, with the temple failing to round 113 without its vengeful ability, and somehow not managing to get past that round with the vengeful temple in any attempts, and I think that's the first time the ability got a 0 rounds worth of progress. And our next map is definitely a little bit less cozy than the last, with it being the Halloween themed map 6 feet, obviously referencing being buried 6 feet underground. And to be honest, I really thought this had a shot at being our worst map yet, because it's like a single lane version of Sprint Track basically. But somehow, despite the fact that the balloons only wrap around a single time, the temple was still able to surpass not just the round 108 mark that Alpine Lake had failed to, but it went on to reach round 112 without the vengeful temple, and then, get this, it actually tied Sprint Track on its first try with it, and then surpassed it by one round on its second, with 115 also being the round it ultimately failed to. Now we're on to River Rapids, and I'm using a pontoon for the temple to be in the middle of this map. You just can't see it underneath the temple's base. But something we can all see together is the fact that intermediate maps consistently have a bit more of a difficult layout than the beginner maps did before, as this is another one that has two paths, which forces the temple to chase back and forth really early, and it can only really hold back mobs and BFBs at this middle point where the two paths meet. ZOMGs are too strong to be held back here, even during the early free play rounds, which forces the temple to basically rely on the straight path at the exit to catch all the balloons, and that's a terrible situation for it, because the temple isn't able to damage anything until it gets to the very end of the track. Thus, it had its worst fails so far, taken out on just round 95 without the Vengeful Temple ability. But since we were still in a relatively early round, that ability was more effective than it normally would be, as it was only dealing with one or two waves of ZOMGs at first, which haven't gained much health or speed yet. So, the Vengeful Temple made the leap all the way to round 103, which is already the farthest jump this ability has given the temple, and then it went to get to round 105 on its second attempt, which is where it also ultimately settled. But at least finally, Alpine Lake can say there's one intermediate map worse than it. Wattle Trees is another map that forces the temple to immediately chase the balloons, but at least they're all coming down a single track this time. And beyond that, the balloons also have to come at the temple head on after a bit, which allows it to hold them back for a while, and they also have to travel around this loop, which of course allows it to shoot through many balloons at once. So with that, in addition to the track being single lane and also relatively long, this was definitely one of the better intermediate maps, as the temple got all the way to round 120 without the Vengeful ability, and then 122 on its first, second, and third try with it. This next map we're on, Pyramids, has a pretty unique layout, and the balloons have to split into two paths to climb each side of the first pyramid, but they're still pretty close together, and these paths also meet in the middle at the top of the pyramid, so the balloons end up getting stacked on top of each other, making this a decent point to hold them back. But once they get past there, the temple basically has nothing besides the fact that it can fire down a straight line at the exit, which at least allows it to catch a decent amount of balloons before they escape, but once anything strong makes it far enough, the temple isn't going to be able to keep up, and it ultimately failed to round 113 without its vengeful ability, before getting to round 116 on its first and second try with it, and then 117 on its final. I'm starting to feel like a broken record, but Dune Sea is yet another map that splits the balloons into two paths and has the temple chasing them back and forth. And of course, the two paths meet in the middle as well, and this doesn't really help the temple very much since they immediately split back into two, sending the balloons around it on each side, and these two bends are pretty decent to catch them, but nothing great honestly. So ultimately, the temple ended up failing on round 105 without the vengeful ability, before tying Alpine Lakes round 108 on its first try with it, which is where the temple ultimately failed here as well. Alright, this is actually getting ridiculous now. Lava Fields is yet another map that splits the balloons into two paths at first, however it does have something the previous maps didn't, which is 3 solid loops where the temple can actually destroy lots of balloons at once. Now, they do split up on the loop, with half of the balloons going each way, but this really isn't too bad for the temple, as it can still catch a bunch of them at once, and ultimately, it ended up getting all the way to round 121 without the Vengeful Temple ability, and with it, we ended up getting to round 122 on the first try, and then 123 on the second and third. Finally, we have another single lane map, and get this, it doesn't even force the balloons to chase at the beginning. Instead, there's an immediate turn out of the entrance that stacks them on top of each other, and then they have to come straight at the temple as well, which was effective for holding them back. There is also one more point where the temple can catch balloons before they're about to escape, which allowed it to reach round 119 without the Vengeful ability, and with it, the temple got to round 121 on its first, second, and third try. Country Road is arguably the most unique map we've encountered so far, as it has the balloons come from a different path every round, with them following a counterclockwise rotation. Since they're coming at the temple in a straight line, that does give it a chance to hold back the balloons for a decent bit, but pretty soon, they begin circling around it, which makes the temple chase pretty badly until the balloons have completed one full loop plus an extra path, as they exit on the path that's next to the path that they entered on. The way this map is set up causes there to be a lot of rounds where it looks like the temple is going to lose, but then it just barely survives. Ultimately, it ended up being able to reach round 107, and the Dark Temple is actually really effective on these straight paths, as you can see here on round 109, which allowed it to get an extra 6 rounds on the first try before going 1 round further on the second, with round 114 being where it ultimately settled as well. Now with the map Jungle, we're back to having the temple chasing balloons on 2 different paths, and overall, there aren't really any good points for it to catch them either. This sort of reminds me of an inverted version of Alpine Lake honestly, with the way balloons travel around 2 really long loops and force the temple to chase the whole time. And thus, it ended up failing to round 106 without the Vengeful ability, and with it, the temple got to round 108 on the first and second try before it just barely beat out Alpine Lake by getting to 109. Workshop is pretty similar to a lot of the other intermediate maps in that it splits the balloons up early on, this time having them going around a gear before they pass by the temple and split down 2 different paths, which makes it pretty hard for it to keep up with all the balloons. Thus, the temple ended up failing on round 109 without the Vengeful ability, which is still just as far as the last map got with the ability, before reaching round 112 on the first, second, and third try. Now, Bloon of Clubs is very similar to Lonely Heart, only instead of traveling around the temple in the shape of a heart, it's now in the shape of a clover instead. Other than that, there isn't too much to say really. The temple has to mostly chase the balloons until they reach these sharp turns in the clover, which does allow the temple to catch them somewhat. It's also able to get them at the end of the track, right before they escape, but ultimately, this layout isn't very ideal, and thus, the temple failed to round 107 without the Vengeful ability, and then proceeded to get to round 111 on the first try with it, and 112 on the second and third. Archipelago is another single lane map, and it has a little bend here at the beginning that stacks the balloons up a bit, and allows the temple to hold them back for a while. But after that, it has to chase them pretty much around the entire map. This bend in the track up here does help the temple out a little bit, but it doesn't do much to stop ZOMGs, and thus, it ended up failing to round 108 without the Vengeful ability here. And with it, the temple ended up reaching round 112 on its first try, and couldn't get any further with the second or third. I think the last 3 maps in a row have all failed to this same round now. Bloons Circles is sort of an interesting map, in that it's a reference to the real life phenomenon of crop circles, and I just think it's cool when the game ties in something from the real world. And as for the temple, it's not a bad map either, with the first circle being a solid loop for it to catch the balloons on. However, once they started getting past this point, it does have to chase them on 2 different paths, which of course is really bad for the temple, and ultimately, it got to round 111 without the vengeful ability. And on its first try with it, round 111 had no ZOMGs at all, which is quite notable for such a high round, and the vengeful ability also got the temple a good bit further, bringing it to round 118 on the first attempt, which it couldn't surpass with the second or third. Slomom is actually a pretty decent map for the temple, with it having a single track that twists back and forth in the beginning, stacking a ton of balloons on top of each other, and allowing the temple to hold them back for a while. Once they pass that point, the temple is forced to chase a decent amount, but the balloons do also stack a little bit near the end of the track, which helps it out a little, and ultimately, the temple was able to reach round 121 without the vengeful ability, which is quite solid for an intermediate map. And with the ability, it was able to reach round 124 on the first attempt, 125 on the second, and 126 with the third. Snake River is yet another intermediate map that forces the temple to chase down the balloons on 2 different paths, but at least they get to join into one path early on, which continues down the rest of the track that way. This allows the temple to stop chasing back and forth, and it can hold back the balloons pretty well when they reach the bend at the bottom of the track, along with being able to shoot through multiple paths as it goes to catch them near the exit, which allowed the temple to reach round 116 without the vengeful ability, and then proceed to get 118 with it on the first try, and 120 on the second and third. Dockside is another single lane track, which is always better for the temple, and there's also a pier at the entrance that the balloons have to travel around, which allows it to hold them back for a decent bit. After that, they also have to come at the temple directly in a straight line, which of course is also great for it, but then it does have to chase them, although the exit is also lined up straight with the temple, which allowed it to clutch out a few more rounds when I thought it was going to fail. And in the end, the temple reached round 117 without the vengeful ability, which is pretty solid, and it got 2 more rounds with it on its first try, which it couldn't surpass after the second or third. Village Shore is a pretty interesting map, because it was actually inspired by the BTD6 menu screen, and the track itself is literally in the shape of a 6. I believe this map was added when BTD6 had just come out as well, so that's definitely a cool way to reference the newest game in the one that came before. But other than that, it's basically just a version of 3 times around, where the balloons only loop twice. However, this loop is a little bit bigger than the one on 3 times around, which allowed the temple to actually get to round 125 without its vengeful ability, just 1 round short of the temple on 3 times around. But with the vengeful ability, all it was able to do is tie the 126 mark with its first, second, and third attempt. And now, we are finally onto the last intermediate map in the game, Trick or Treat. This is another cool map, just because it's pretty unique, especially with the fact that it's actually set at nighttime, which gives the map a much different vibe than many of the others we played on so far. But for the temple itself, this map isn't quite as cool, as the layout forces it to immediately chase the balloons, although they do have to travel around this bend in the track when going through the first house, which is a great spot for the temple to shred through lots of balloons and hold them back. Beyond that, it has to chase again until they exit the third house and are lined up pretty well for the temple to shoot through many balloons at once, which definitely helps some and allowed it to reach round 115 without the vengeful ability before getting to 118 on the first, second, and third try with it. Our first advanced map of this video is going to be Cash Money, which is literally in the shape of a giant dollar, and just like I did with the first intermediate map, I've begun recording on round 50 because now I'm not exactly sure how far the temple is going to be getting to. Advanced maps are still long enough for it to do something solid, but this is where the game actually starts getting a bit difficult. As you can see, on this particular map, the balloons have to chase 2 different paths of balloons coming from opposite sides, which easily slip by it as they travel down the wavy parts of the dollar sign. But the balloons have to escape on the middle section, which has a straight path at the top and bottom that's perfectly lined up for the temple to fire down, so basically, it's relying on these paths to catch balloons before they're escaping, which of course, is never a good situation for the temple to be in. And thus, it ended up failing to round 104 without the vengeful ability, before getting to 105 on its first try with it, and then just 1 round short of tying Alpine Lake with round 107 on its second and third try. Egg Hunt has 2 paths of balloons that immediately cross over each other at the entrance, before going up each side of the egg-shaped track, with the left path traveling around the egg and the right path going through the crack in the middle of it. Thankfully, as the temple chases the outside path, it's also able to catch balloons on the inside path, which does help it out a little bit. However, the balloons going around the egg are really hard for the temple to catch and quickly begin to overwhelm it. Thus, it ended up losing on round 103 without the vengeful ability, and with it, the temple was able to reach round 108 on the first and second try before getting to 109 on its third. Now I'm thinking Day of the Undead could end up being the best advanced map in the entire game, since it only has 1 path, and it's a relatively long track for the advanced category as well. Additionally, the track forms the shape of a monkey's head, and these ears should provide solid loops for the temple to catch a lot of balloons. Or at least that's what I thought, as I quickly found that it wasn't long before the ZOMGs were already too powerful to be caught there, and thus, the temple actually failed on just round 104 without the vengeful ability. And with it, we ended up getting one extra round on the first attempt before making it to 107 with the second and third. So I'll admit, I was totally wrong with what I expected to happen here, but I also think Land's End is another map with solid potential. It's also a single lane track with a decent track length, and the balloons have to come straight on at the temple from the entrance. Now I'll admit, that didn't do much to hold back ZOMGs, but this track also has a really big loop at the halfway point, which we all know is always great for the temple. And sure enough, this became the first advanced track where the tempo surpassed round 110, and it didn't even need the vengeful ability to do so. In fact, it got all the way to round 113 without it, before getting to 114 on the first try, 115 on the second, and 116 on the third. I think that's the first time the rounds went up by exactly 1 on every single try. Now I'm honestly getting kind of surprised by the number of single lane advanced maps that we've gotten so far, as Tidal Pools is yet another one, and I also think it has some decent potential as it features 2 prominent partial loops, which of course are always good for the temple. And sure enough, this was the second advanced map where it could break the 110 mark, getting to round 111 without the vengeful ability. Then, on its first try with it, the temple failed at the same round, but its second attempt made up for this by getting all the way to round 115, and then it tied Land's End by getting to round 116 on the third. Now we have yet another advanced map with a single lane, but this one is a little bit different. Bigfoot is literally, well, a big foot that the balloons have to travel around. But they don't complete a loop around it. Instead, they alternate between the top and bottom path every round and head directly to the exit. The temple can catch the balloons at the entrance and a little bit on the track, but it mainly has to chase them. However, the temple still managed to tie our worst map so far, River Rapids, without the vengeful ability at round 105, before getting to 107 on its first and second try with it, and then getting to round 109 on its final try. This next map, Igloos, also switches the balloons between 2 different paths. However, they are both much longer and give the temple a few good opportunities to actually hold the balloons back for a while, like this small loop down here, or this part of the track where the balloons have to come at the temple head on. And thus, this ended up being another really solid advanced map, with the temple getting all the way to round 114 without the vengeful ability, before setting a new record with round 117 on its first try, which it unfortunately could not beat with the second or third. Battle Knots is the first map we've encountered that actually has the balloons coming from 3 different paths at once, which of course is quite difficult to defend against. However, on this map, the 3 paths sort of intertwine and wrap around the temple, which helps it shred through a lot of balloons at once. Still though, this certainly wasn't the best map for it, as the temple failed to round 108 without the vengeful ability, before getting to 109 on the first try with it, and then 110 on the second and third. Candyland takes things to the next level by having the balloons come from 4 different paths, with them forming these 2 spirals on each side of the temple. And it basically has to rely on those spirals in order to even survive basically anything here, as the temple ended up failing on just round 93 without its vengeful ability. But just like on River Rapids, where the temple had failed around 95, the vengeful ability did make a huge difference because it was facing relatively easy free play rounds, which allowed it to add another 9 rounds to the temple's score on its first attempt, before getting to round 104 on the second and third, leaving Candyland as the new worst map by just a single round. But I think this next map we're on might be the toughest advanced map in all of BTD5. Crypt Keeper starts off looking pretty tame, with the entrance having a small straight path for the temple to fire down before it splits into 2 paths. But after that, things get a little more interesting. The balloons don't have to travel far to reach these huts at the end of each path, and upon entering them, they're then able to exit on 5 different paths per hut for 10 total. And basically, as soon as we got into free play, the temple failed on just round 87. And unlike the River Rapids or Candyland one, the Vengeful Temple here can't do much of anything to help. In fact, it still failed to round 87 on the first try, before getting to 88 on the second, and you can literally see that even when the ability is active, balloons keep on escaping on all the different paths, and then the temple got one more round with its third attempt, ultimately settling on a record low of just round 89, being the first temple to not even make it to 100. Normally, long range would also be one of the hardest advanced maps, but the temple happens to have a very long range itself, so this map's main gimmick isn't an issue. Additionally, this bend in the beginning of the track is pretty great for holding back the balloons. However, once they get past it, the balloons are basically one strong push away from ruining the temple's day, as it has to chase them all the way to the exit, and then it's forced to keep struggling to survive from there. Thus, the temple ended up failing to round 106 without the vengeful ability, and then it also failed there on its first try with it, before getting to 108 on the second and third try. On Water Hazard, the temple has to fight the balloons off on 2 different paths for quite a long time, but at the very least, these paths are quite long, and basically, they're both just giant turns, which stacks 2 lanes of balloons on top of each other for a while. Additionally, the 2 paths do eventually merge into one and cross a dock, which forces them to come straight at the temple, and then they have to actually travel around it on a tiny island that you can't even see because the temple is on top of it. But as you can see here on round 108, this allows the temple to not just catch the balloons that are circling it, but also hit all the balloons that are traveling down the 2 big turns as well. Thus, this was another really good advanced map, with the temple reaching round 113 without the ability. Then it actually failed to the same round with it, before managing to get to round 114 on the second try and 115 on the third. Rink Revenge has a layout that reminds me of the map Igloos, with 2 different paths to defend that are both long and winding. Only the 2 paths on this track are almost identical to each other. Although it didn't take me long to realize, this map is actually worse than Igloos was, because there aren't really any points for the temple to actually catch balloons, leading to it losing on round 104 without the vengeful ability. And with it, the temple ended up getting to round 108 on its first and second try, before ultimately settling on 110. Challenger Deep is another map that's inspired by a real life place with the same name, and it's actually the deepest known point in the entire ocean and on Earth itself. So that's always pretty cool to see, but the actual map itself isn't so great for the temple, as it forces it to pretty much chase the balloons around the entire map. The temple can catch them a little bit at the top left corner here, but ceramics in particular are pretty bad for the temple here, forcing it to waste time chasing them down, and thus, it ended up failing on just round 98 without the vengeful temple ability. And with it, we did get to round 104, and then 105 with the second try, and 107 on the third, which is a pretty notable improvement. In a way, this next map, Scorched Earth, is kind of like Battleknot in that 3 paths come at you at once, and then all intertwine around the temple, but the big difference is that this map has a much more geometric layout. Well, I quickly discovered another difference as well, which is that the balloons have to spend a lot more time in the cluster, which of course helps the temple a ton. In fact, this quickly became the best advanced map so far, with it being able to first surpass the round 120 mark without even needing the Vengeful Temple ability, and ended up getting to round 121, and then with the ability, the temple just barely survived on round 122 with 3 lives to its name, before failing on round 123 with all 3 tries. U-Turn is another map that forces the temple to immediately chase 2 different paths, which of course is always terrible for it, and it doesn't really have a good way to catch them either, until the 2 waves of balloons overlap each other while making the big turn on the track, and this did allow the temple to hold off the balloons for a bit, but pretty quickly, they were beginning to overwhelm it, and the temple actually managed to just barely survive round 99 with only 6 lives left before failing 1 round later. With the Dark Temple ability, it got to round 104 on its first and second try before getting 1 extra round with its final attempt. The Great Divide doesn't let you be objective with placing your temple in the center, so you're forced to end up neglecting one of the 2 paths, but honestly, this didn't end up mattering nearly as much as I expected, and instead, the map was simply difficult for the same reason any other 2-lane map is, especially when there aren't many spots to catch the balloons. It can get them where they're going around these bends, but that only helps so much, and it ended up failing around 97 without the Vengeful Temple, before getting to round 106 on it with its first try, which definitely is more impressive, but it also failed there on its second and third. The eye looks like it's pretty similar to Battleknot, but balloons only come from one of the 4 paths at a time, and they're all relatively short as well. Unlike on Country Road, the paths now switch every round in a clockwise rotation, and the beginning of each path is lined up relatively well with the temple for it to hold back the balloons for a decently long time. Once they get past it though, the balloons make a sharp turn around the temple, which can be worse depending on which path you're on. It's also pretty hard for the temple to catch all the fast moving ceramics, and it ended up getting to round 112 without the Vengeful ability, which is definitely solid for an advanced map, before failing to 112 again, and you can actually see here, this is probably the hardest of the 4 paths for actually catching balloons on that turn. Then it managed to reach round 114 on the second try, and ultimately failed there on the third as well. Phase Portals is a really long advanced map, but the temple had to immediately chase the balloons for the entirety of the first 2 paths. However, the third path is where things get a lot more interesting, as it's a perfectly straight line that faces the temple head on, which allows it to directly fire down it and thus destroy a ton of balloons at once. This allowed the temple to reach round 112 on its first try without the Vengeful ability, before it proceeded to get another 6 rounds on its first try with it, and 118 is also where it ultimately settled. Lightning Scar is the same map from the Wizard Lord special mission in this game, and the entrance allows the temple to hold hold the balloons back for a decent bit, but what's even more effective is the zigzag that the balloons do right after that point, as it stacks a bunch of them on top of each other and allows the temple to keep them from getting to the point where they can split into two different paths for quite a while. Once the balloons do reach that point, they also have to come at the temple head on from each path, which helps it a little bit as well, and ultimately allow this to be another really impressive advanced map, as the temple reached round 118 without the vengeful ability, before getting to round 121 on its first and second try with it, and then 122 on its third, just one round short of Scorched Earth. This next map, Switch, forces the balloons to come down a long straight path directly at the temple, which of course allows it to hold the balloons back for a while. However, once they get past that point, this map has a cool feature where the pipes actually switch, well, hence the name, meaning that the balloons alternate between the top path, the bottom path, and both. Certainly, only dealing with one path of balloons is a lot better for the temple, as you can see here between round 107 where it's chasing one path and round 108 where it's chasing both, and pretty soon after this point, the temple ended up losing for the first time on round 113 without its ability, and then it proceeded to lose to 114 on the first try with it, and honestly, I think that the bottom path is also worse than the top one now, because it forces the temple to chase a lot more, and then it ended up losing to 115 on the second try with a ton of 0 MGs, before also losing to that round again on its third try. Mount Magma is another map that doesn't allow the temple to be very close to the center of it, but this one is pretty good for the temple because all of the balloons come out of an active volcano in a spiral formation, which of course stacks a ton of balloons on top of each other. This allowed Mount Magma to be one of the stronger advanced maps, but once the balloons get to the last loop of the spiral, they'll begin escaping on 4 different paths, which is where the temple is quickly going to fail. Ultimately, it got to round 116 without the vengeful ability, before getting to 118 on its first try with it, and then to round 120 on its second and third. And now, we are on to the last advanced map of BTD5, Siege, which has the balloons coming at the temple from 4 different paths, and they all pass directly by it, not giving the temple any good chance to catch the balloons. Thus, you can see the temple is already struggling to deal with 0 MGs in the very early free play rounds, and it ended up losing to round 97 without the vengeful ability, before failing to the same round 2 more times with it, and then ultimately, it settled on round 98 with its final attempt. The first expert map of the video, Tributaries, also has 4 paths to defend, but the difference is that they all merge into one at the end, which is very helpful for the temple. And pretty soon, it was able to surpass the last map we just played, Siege, without even needing the vengeful ability, getting to round 106, and then, on its first try with the ability, the temple got to round 107, before making it to round 108 on its second and third try. And once again, the balloons are coming at the temple from 4 different paths with this next map, Double Cross. But each path does have to come straight at the temple, which definitely helps it some, and additionally, it can also catch the balloons as all 4 paths cross over the temple at once. Of course, the temple is also firing down straight paths as it chases the balloons towards the exit, and thus, it was able to get to round 105 without the vengeful ability, before making it to round 108 on its first try with it, which the temple could not surpass with its second or third. Tunnels is often considered to be the easiest expert map in BTD5, and it's pretty easy to see why that's the case. Moab class balloons can still be hit even when they're entering the tunnels, which makes this map longer than some of the intermediates I'm pretty sure, and additionally, there's not anything else to make this map challenging, with it actually being a single lane track, and the middle path actually comes at the temple head on as well. This allowed it to become the first expert map to surpass the round 110 mark without even needing the vengeful ability, ultimately failing to round 114, and then the temple was able to complete another 6 rounds on its first try with it, which is absolutely insane to think an expert map can get to round 120, but it could not get any further with that second or third try. Castle is definitely a lot harder for the temple, as it has to chase down 2 different paths of balloons without any good points to catch them. And these 2 paths do merge at the very end, but it's not very much to help the temple out, which led to it failing on just round 89. Although this early of a free play round isn't normally so difficult, which is why we do 3 tries with the Vengeful Temple. And with it, we were able to get all the way to round 96 on the first try, 98 on the second, before settling on exactly round 100 with the third. Clock is an interesting map because the time on it actually changes every round, with the little hand of the clock determining when the balloons have to go from the inside to the outside of the track. The temples can catch some balloons at the beginning as well, since they have to come in it in a straight line, but pretty soon, it was clear that the temple has to rely on that part where the balloons are actually making the transition between the 2 tracks. At first, I thought that having the little hand at the 12 position was actually going to be really bad, since the balloons travel all the way around the inside track getting chased, and then escape straight to the exit, and there were some leaks here on round 108, but the temple survived and I quickly realized having it at the 1 position is actually a lot worse, as the ceramics have gained a good bit of speed at this point, which allowed them to escape on the outside track immediately. And even with the Vengeful Temple, we could not get past round 109 with all 3 tries, which I think is only the second time that that's happened during this entire video. Drag Strip is a pretty cool map, and for me, it brings back some childhood memories of actually going to a drag strip in real life, and you can even see the 2 cars zoom by at the start of each round. But for the temple, this map definitely isn't so cool, as it forces it to chase 2 different paths without any really good points to catch them. Thus, it quickly begins struggling with ZOMGs as they gain speed and health every round, leading to it losing on round 101 without the Vengeful ability, before getting to 105 on its first try with it, which the tempo could not surpass with the second or third. Death Valley is well known for being one of the harder maps in BTD5, because it not only has 2 paths to defend at once, but one of them happens to be pretty tiny, and thus, the tempo almost immediately failed once free play started and it had to defend tougher balloons on the small path. With the Vengeful ability, we were able to get to round 91 on the first try and 92 on the second, which is where the tempo also failed with its third. Treetop is kind of like Drag Strip in the sense that 2 different passive balloons come at the temple at once without any real good points to catch them. But the difference here, other than the scenery of course, is that these paths are a bit longer and much more winding. I also realized that the bottom path seems to be worse, and it's actually because the tempo can still hit balloons passing by on the top path as it's chasing balloons at the bottom, which leads to that being where the tempo ends up failing. Although not as quickly as I had expected, as it was able to survive to round 106 without the Vengeful ability, and then it did fail to the same round on the first try with it, before managing to get to round 107 on the second try and 108 on the third. This next map, Runway, looks really cool with it being set at nighttime, because you get to see all the lights on the track. But this is yet another map that has the temple chasing 2 different paths of balloons at the same time, and it can hold them back at the entrance during the early free play rounds, but soon it's forced to begin chasing and rely on this bend to catch the balloons on the inside track. The temple ended up getting to round 106 without the Vengeful ability, which is the same as the last map, and then it went on to get to round 108 on its first try with the ability and 109 on the second and third. Down the Drain doesn't let you place your temple in the center at all, so I had to choose the spot that I thought was the most objective for it, but this is the first time where I'm not even sure if the temple will make it to free play, because this is one of the hardest maps in all of BTD5. It's sort of like a warm-up for tar pits in a way, as there are 4 different short paths you have to defend at once, and for the temple, it's forced to chase the entire time on all 4 of them. And you can see this is already happening with the round 43 ceramics, but the temple did manage to get into free play with only a few lives lost, and surprisingly, actually didn't fail until round 89 either. And with the Vengeful ability, we did fail to the same round again, but ended up getting to 91 on the second try, along with the third. That's really insane to think that Crypt Keeper was even worse than this map is for the temple. Bengalia is another map that's based on a real life place, this time a city in the country of Angola. I believe that city also has a lot of ocean and is known for its coastlines, which is why the map looks the way it does. It's also another tough map for the temple, with 3 short paths that breeze right by it, giving the temple no good chances to catch the balloons. However, this still wasn't quite as bad as the last map we just faced, and thus, the temple was still able to get to round 94 without the Vengeful ability, and with it, we did get another 3 rounds on the first try, before ultimately settling on round 99 after the second and third attempt. But this next map, Web, is a whole lot better for the temple, as balloons are only following a single path for the entire track, and I didn't even realize that there's any expert tracks like that besides tunnels. But also, the beginning of the track is perfectly set up for the temple to hold back balloons for a really long time. Once the balloons have to begin navigating through the web, they get stacked on top of each other as well, which of course is also great for the temple, and this allowed it to get all the way to round 119 without the Vengeful ability, where the temple just barely failed, and with its ability, it got up to round 124 on the first, second, and third try. And now, we're on to the last expert map in BTD5, Forest Path. And this is another map with 2 short paths that the temple has to chase, and it can't really take advantage of this part on the bottom path where the balloons come at the temple head on, because it also has to chase the balloons on the top path at the same time, which end up going through a tunnel and subverting the temple's priorities even more, and all of this led to it quickly getting overwhelmed on round 92. Then, it first lost to round 94 with the Vengeful Temple ability, but it went on to get all the way to round 102 on its second attempt, as I was able to use the ability to clear out ZOMGs right before they would overwhelm the temple, and then it was able to get to round 104 on the final attempt. The first extreme map of the game is called Campfire, which doesn't sound so extreme until you see the actual track layout. The temple has to defend 3 different short paths at once, and it was still able to reach the free play rounds here without any issues. However, the early free play rounds were already posing a big challenge, and it wasn't long before the temple had failed for the first time on round 91. before managing to reach 95 on its first and second try, and then 96 on its third, which is pretty crazy that an extreme map can still perform better than the hardest advanced one. And Toxic Waste isn't quite as bad for the temple as Campfire was either, as there are 4 paths that come directly at it, but they do form 2 spirals before exiting in the center of them. So this does allow the temple to hold off Bloons for a little bit, although they're relying on the section of the track where Bloons are constantly about to escape, which led to it still failing on round 93. Then it also failed to round 93 again with its first try with the Vengeful Temple, but we did manage to get to round 97 on the second try and 99 on the third. And now we have finally made it to the hardest map in all of BTD5, Tar Pits. It's a name that strikes fear into the hearts of many a BTD5 veteran, not including myself though, cause I don't think I was ever good enough to even beat it on Flash, and you can easily see why this map is so difficult, with the temple having to defend 5 tiny paths at once that are literally just circles where it has to chase the Bloons constantly. So, just like with Down the Drain, I really began to wonder if this would finally be the map where the temple fails before free play. For a while, I really started to think it might not even happen here, as the temple was looking comfortable for most of the game. But, on round 84, which always has 50 Moabs and 10 BFBs, it did actually fail without the Vengeful Temple ability. With it, we were able to get through round 84, and the temple also survived the first ZOMG, but it probably failed to round 86 once again. After that, I was surprised when the temple did survive rounds 86 and 87 before failing to 88 on its second and third try, which is amazing to think that Tar Pits was only 1 round short of Crypt Keeper. Now we're going from the hardest map in all of BTD5 to the easiest of all the extreme maps. Main Street actually gives the temple a chance to shoot down the 2 paths that are coming at it, so I have to say, it honestly looked decently comfortable during the early free play rounds. To be fair, the temple did lose to round 99 without the Vengeful ability, but this already ties Toxic Waste for the highest round of any extreme map, and with the ability, we got an insane amount of mileage, as it did a great job of destroying ZOMGs on both the paths before they could pass the temple, which allowed it to get all the way to round 109 on its first try, and then to 110 on the second and third, which is actually better than all but 2 of the expert maps. And this feels so good to say, we are finally on the very last map in Bloons Tower Defense 5. Well, at least all the single player ones. Just like Main Street, Bloontonium Lab is not completely terrible for the temple. There are 3 different paths it has to defend on this map, but they all come at the temple straight on, and then have to escape on another path just like it. And the temple was able to get to round 96 without the Vengeful ability, however, it would prove not to be as powerful here as it had been on the last map, as we only got to round 98 on the first and second try with it, before ultimately getting to round 100 with the third. And that is it. A max temple on every single map in Bloons Tower Defense 5. No joke, I spent 55 hours in the last 4 days getting this video ready in time to upload, and I was already on the intermediate maps at that point. So yeah, this was quite the effort, and if you look on screen, you'll see the top 25 maps overall, and that letter in parentheses just stands for whichever difficulty the map was, but what I'm going to do here is actually explain the stream I was talking about in the beginning of this video, while also showing the leaderboards for each individual difficulty. So, it's going to be 4 AM Pacific time or 7 AM Eastern Standard Time that I start, but I'm going to be going for 24 hours, which I believe should be a record for a Bloons dedicated stream, and I plan to include several different games of course, but also, there's going to be a lot of viewer engagement as well. I'm going to have ways incorporated for you to actually add random disasters to my game, for example. Like I could be trying to beat random missions in BTD5, but if I gain a certain amount of subs, I'll spin a wheel, and that could force me to beat the challenge with, let's say, only 1 tower, just as a random example. And like, there would be actual weight to it, because I won't be allowed to skip that mission unless someone else, let's say, gifts a channel membership to undo any disaster of their choosing. That way, viewers can have an impact on how easy or difficult my experience is, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how this goes. I greatly appreciate anyone who's watched to the very end, and if you enjoyed this video, you might also want to know how far all of the special agents can make it in Bloons Tower Defense 5.